In 2007, a quiet storm began brewing in the world of nicotine consumption. The e-cigarette, a sleek and futuristic device, entered the scene with a promise so bold it felt almost utopian. A cleaner, safer alternative to smoking. It was a revolutionary idea, one that offered a glimmer of hope in a world where traditional cigarettes had become synonymous with disease and death. By 2012, this niche innovation was exploding onto the mainstream stage. Sales were skyrocketing, and vaping was no longer a quirky subculture but a booming global phenomenon. Between 2011 and 2015, the number of vapers worldwide surged from 7 million to 35 million, a figure that would more than double by 2021. The momentum was fueled by a perfect storm of circumstances. Public awareness campaigns had made smoking socially taboo, while relentless anti-tobacco regulations left smokers searching for an escape route. The e-cigarette stepped into this void, marketed as a guilt-free way to satisfy nicotine cravings without the ashtrays, odors, or stigma of smoking. Early adopters touted it as a life-changing alternative, and health officials cautiously endorsed its potential to reduce smoking rates. But it wasn't just smokers who were captivated. The devices were sleek and customizable, and flavored e-liquids offered something for everyone, from the nostalgic warmth of tobacco to the playful sweetness of bubblegum. What began as a tool for harm reduction quickly became a cultural juggernaut. However, as vaping gained traction, so did its unintended consequences. What had once been heralded as a public health breakthrough was being scrutinized as a new kind of addiction. Teen vaping skyrocketed, with high nicotine devices like Juul at the forefront of the epidemic. Flavored pods marketed as harmless fun were pulling in a younger audience, many of whom had never smoked a cigarette before. What started as a noble mission to disrupt big tobacco now bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the very industry it had sought to destroy. To truly understand how we arrived at this moment, we must go back to the beginning. In 2004, Adam Bowen and James Monsees were just two design students at Stanford University, sneaking out for cigarette breaks during long nights in the studio. Smoking wasn't just a habit for them, it was a moment to unwind, a ritual they shared. But as design students, they couldn't stop themselves from critiquing the very product they were consuming. Was there a way to keep the experience of smoking, the calming inhale, the social bonding, but remove the harm? Their curiosity turned into an obsession. While digging deeper, they stumbled upon something extraordinary. Big Tobacco had already explored this idea decades ago. Hidden in old documents were studies showing that heating tobacco into vapor, instead of burning it, drastically reduced the toxic chemicals in smoke. It was a breakthrough, but Big Tobacco had buried it, unwilling to risk admitting that traditional cigarettes were deadly. To Adam and James, this wasn't just an idea, it was a challenge. Where Big Tobacco had chosen profits over progress, they saw an opportunity to do both, save lives while creating something revolutionary. That night, the seed was planted for a product that would change everything. Big Tobacco to them was the villain, a sprawling, corrupt empire profiting from addiction and death. They saw themselves as the heroes, armed with the tools of design and technology, ready to dismantle that empire with a product that could save lives. With this belief fueling them, they launched their first company, Ploom. Adam and James envisioned a product that would offer smokers the nicotine they craved without the tar and toxins of combustion. It would preserve the rituals of smoking, holding something in your hand, the inhale, the exhale, but in a way that was cleaner, modern, and appealing. The duo poured their savings into the venture, working out of cramped spaces and cobbling together a team of like-minded individuals who believed in their mission. But building Ploom wasn't easy. Designing a completely new way to consume nicotine came with countless challenges. Early prototypes were crude and riddled with flaws. In one disastrous trial, a prototype caught fire in the middle of a demonstration. The heating mechanisms they had hoped would be revolutionary were proving unreliable and dangerous. By this time, other vaping devices were entering the market. But these early vapes were large, clunky, and uncomfortable to use, hardly an appealing alternative for smokers. Adam and James saw an opportunity here. If they could create a device that prioritized sleekness, simplicity, and ease of use, they could set themselves apart. With their design backgrounds, the pair focused intensely on aesthetics. The Ploom device was small, elegant, and modern, resembling something out of a sci-fi film rather than the gritty world of cigarettes. On the surface, it looked like a triumph, a beautiful, futuristic alternative to smoking. But the flaws ran deeper than they'd imagined. Ploom's heating mechanism was still dangerously unstable, with some users reporting that the device became so hot it burned their hands. Worse, it struggled to deliver the satisfying hit of nicotine smokers were accustomed to. Smokers began using two Ploom devices at once just to get the kick they needed. Many users complained that Ploom simply wasn't satisfying, dismissing it as a gimmick rather than a genuine alternative to cigarettes. The final blow came when reports of malfunctions began to flood in. The device's heating element, which had been central to its design, occasionally caused the entire unit to become flammable. The risks were too great. Adam and James were forced to face the devastating truth. Ploom had failed. As the dust settled, Adam and James regrouped. They began sketching a new idea, one that would take everything they had learned from their failures and turn it into something extraordinary. They called it Juul. Juul's rise was nothing short of meteoric. With a design so minimalistic that it resembled a USB flash drive, Juul was lightweight, portable, and incredibly easy to use. But more than that, it offered a level of convenience and nicotine satisfaction that surpassed everything that had come before it. The key to Juul's success wasn't just its design, but its ability to meet the cravings of smokers while attracting a new generation of users. Juul pods, filled with nicotine salts, provided a smoother hit compared to traditional e-cigarettes, delivering a much more potent and satisfying experience. They hit the sweet spot, delivering nicotine in a way that traditional cigarettes did, but with the added benefit of being odorless and easily concealed. The company's marketing strategy was aggressive and methodical. One of the first moves was a heavy social media push. Influencers and well-placed advertisements targeted platforms like Instagram and YouTube. With sleek visuals and lifestyle-oriented campaigns, Juul portrayed its product as a chic, desirable alternative to cigarettes. Sales exploded. In 2017 alone, Juul's market share surged from nearly nothing to 30%, and by 2018, it commanded over 70% of the e-cigarette market in the US. Their success wasn't just due to the product itself, it was the way they marketed it. They tapped into a young, rebellious spirit, making Juul seem like the ultimate symbol of freedom, convenience, and modernity. They made smoking or vaping cool again, but with one critical difference. It wasn't smoking in the traditional sense. By the end of 2018, Juul was valued at $38 billion. However, there were dark currents beneath the surface. Their campaign inadvertently turned Juul into a symbol for teenagers looking for a way to rebel. Rather than focusing on adult smokers, Juul's viral rise was fueled by an explosion in youth usage. The young audience didn't just see Juul as a healthier alternative, they saw it as something they weren't supposed to have. This is where things began to go horribly wrong. To counteract growing concerns about teen vaping, Juul's marketing team launched campaigns targeting schools and young adults, claiming that their product was designed strictly for adult smokers who wanted to quit. They even went so far as to send agents to schools, warning kids about the dangers of vaping. Ironically, these actions only seemed to escalate the appeal. The more Juul tried to tell teenagers not to use the product, the more they wanted to. It was a classic case of reverse psychology. The actions backfired, and Juul found itself the center of a youth vaping epidemic, with school bathrooms turning into hotspots for clandestine vaping. Meanwhile, Big Tobacco, specifically companies like Altria and British American Tobacco, watched the rise of Juul with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. While Juul was making headlines for its revolutionary product, Big Tobacco was working quietly behind the scenes, using its massive resources to replicate and expand Juul's success. But Juul had a serious advantage. Its product was better. While Big Tobacco's e-cigarettes were often clunky, poorly designed, and underwhelming, Juul's sleek, easy-to-use system offered an experience that was as satisfying as smoking itself. The nicotine salts in Juul's pods allowed for a smoother, more potent experience, creating an instant bond with its users. The very thing that made Juul so appealing also made it dangerously addictive. The younger demographic, initially a part of Juul's marketing strategy, now made up a significant portion of its user base. Juul became a gateway for young people to nicotine. The long-term health risks of nicotine salts, especially in such concentrated amounts, were still unknown, but the dangers of the product's rise were becoming all too clear. Lawsuits piled up, the FDA intervened, and public backlash grew louder. Things were looking pretty bad for Juul, and they were about to get much worse. What started as a device designed to help adult smokers quit had spiraled into an overwhelming issue as teenagers now flocked to the product. Middle and high school students were especially prominent among users. A study published in JAMA in 2019 found that 27.5% of high school students and 10.5% of middle school students had used e-cigarettes in the past 30 days. The data was undeniable. Juul was no longer just an adult alternative. It was now a cultural phenomenon among teens. Realizing the disastrous shift, Juul tried to distance itself from the younger market. They launched a major rebranding campaign in an attempt to shift their focus to adults. The company revamped its advertising strategy, pulling back from platforms popular with teens like Instagram and YouTube, and even removing flavors that had proven particularly popular with younger users, such as mango and cucumber. But the damage had already been done. In the eyes of the public, Juul was synonymous with teenage addiction. The headlines were brutal. News outlets and advocacy groups widely criticized Juul for what they saw as a failure to control the spread of its product among teens. The backlash was swift and unrelenting, with accusations of targeting young people, using social media influencers to glamorize the product, and disregarding the public health consequences. The scrutiny intensified when the FDA stepped in. The agency, which had been slow to act on vaping products initially, began investigating Juul's role in the youth vaping crisis. Juul was forced to meet with the FDA to prove their product was safe and that they weren't deliberately marketing to minors. In response, Juul submitted studies claiming their products were designed only for adult smokers and that they were committed to enforcing age restrictions. But public trust had eroded. The damage done by their previous marketing and the widespread use among teenagers was a hard fact to shake. During this time, Altria, formerly Philip Morris, was watching the situation unfold closely. The tobacco giant at this point was struggling to stem the decline of traditional cigarette sales. As the FDA ramped up its investigations and public scrutiny reached a boiling point, Altria saw a big opportunity. With Juul facing mounting pressure, including potential fines and restrictions on sales, Altria swooped in for a more significant move. On December 20th, 2019, Altria bought a 35% stake in Juul for $12.8 billion, effectively gaining control over the company. Adam and James, who had started with a mission to save lives, were now working alongside the industry they had always viewed as the villain. And with this acquisition, it was clear. The dream of a healthier alternative to cigarettes was now deeply entangled with the very forces they once sought to challenge. The FDA, armed with new studies and data, began to uncover a troubling truth. Juul's marketing was directly targeting teenagers. Despite the company's public assertions to the contrary, researchers found that Juul's ads were not only featured on social media platforms heavily populated by teens, but also used imagery and messaging that spoke to youth culture. A key finding in the FDA's investigation came from their analysis of advertising campaigns. The FDA's 2019 report highlighted that Juul had used influencer marketing, posting on youth-centric platforms like Instagram and YouTube, where younger audiences were most engaged. This strategy was seen as an intentional attempt to tap into the desires of teenagers. The FDA also faced a significant challenge in determining the health claims of vaping. Despite Juul's claims of being a healthier alternative to cigarettes, the agency could not find sufficient evidence to substantiate the health benefits. Vaping, they argued, still involved nicotine, and the long-term effects were unknown. As the pressure mounted, Congress invited James Monsees to testify under oath in 2019. Under intense questioning, Monsees struggled to explain how the company had failed to adequately control youth usage of their product. Critics were quick to point out the contradictions between Juul's messaging and the reality of its reach. While Juul claimed its target market was adult smokers, the evidence pointed to an entirely different story, one where teenagers had become the largest and most enthusiastic consumers. As Juul was at its breaking point, the situation took an even darker turn. Reports from hospitals across the U.S. began to surface, detailing a rise in vaping-related illnesses, particularly among teens. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention launched an investigation into what would come to be known as vaping-associated lung injury. Health officials began seeing a disturbing pattern: an increasing number of hospitalizations among young people with severe respiratory symptoms.
Daniel Ament was a healthy high school student who loved to sail, swim, and run. Then he started vaping. His doctors say his lungs were destroyed beyond repair.
It started off just whenever I'd be with my friends on the weekends, I would just hit theirs.
The symptoms were eerily similar across cases. Teens were experiencing shortness of breath, chest pain, cough, fever, nausea, and vomiting. Many of the cases were severe, with some teens requiring intensive care. By the end of 2019, there were reports of at least 68 vaping-related deaths in the United States. It was later determined that these deaths were mostly linked to black market vaping products that contained vitamin E acetate, a thickening agent used in illicit cannabis cartridges. While Juul devices themselves weren't directly responsible for the fatal cases, the fact remained that the Juul brand was now entangled in the public's perception of the vaping crisis. As news of these deaths spread, social media erupted in fury. Platforms like Twitter and Instagram saw a surge of anti-Juul posts, with users expressing their anger and frustration. News outlets began to pile on. Protests against the company broke out across the US and sales plummeted. Their reputation, once pristine, was now irreparably damaged. Despite not being directly responsible for the black market products, Juul found itself facing intense scrutiny. It didn't matter that Juul was not at fault for the illicit use of their devices. It was still their product that had gotten into the hands of the wrong people. The CDC and FDA issued stern warnings about the dangers of vaping, and a wave of lawsuits flooded the courts. By 2020, Juul was facing over 3,500 individual lawsuits, alleging everything from deceptive marketing practices to negligence regarding the health risks of vaping. The company had to pay millions in settlements, and it was forced to recall hundreds of thousands of flavored pods from the market. By the end of 2020, Juul's valuation had plummeted from $38 billion to around $5 billion. In the aftermath of the crisis, many of Juul's original employees, including Adam Bowen and James Monsees, resigned. The company's staff was now filled with former big tobacco executives, and the core values of innovation and rebellion had been replaced with corporate pragmatism. But while Juul's fall from grace was dramatic, the wider vaping industry didn't collapse. Newer vaping brands emerged, each offering their own versions of e-cigarettes, many of which still struggled to navigate the uncertain landscape. Today, we still don't know the long-term effects of vaping. What we do know is that vaping remains a significant health concern, especially for younger people. Studies continue to emerge on the potential risks, but the long-term effects, particularly with regards to respiratory and cardiovascular health, are still largely unknown. Teens who once saw vaping as a trend are now stuck with an addiction they never intended to have. With one user saying, "It just seemed cool at the time, now I can't stop, and I wish I never started." The vaping debate remains divided. Some argue that vaping is a useful tool for adult smokers trying to quit. Others see it as a gateway to nicotine addiction. The vaping industry started with good intentions but quickly spiraled into a public health crisis, leaving countless lives impacted by addiction and misleading marketing. But what if I told you that vaping isn't the only addiction we should be worried about? There's another substance lurking in our everyday lives, one that has quietly become a hidden epidemic in its own right: caffeine. To uncover the disturbing truth about caffeine and how it's been cleverly marketed just like vaping, click on the video on the screen right now.